All right, hello everybody, and welcome to our lecture on the Miracle on the Han River, which refers to the economic development and really just dramatic modernization and industrialization of South Korea. And we will look at the historical origins of this and really try to problematize what these implications are. So when we think of South Korea today and how it's depicted in images, media, um, various scholarly works, etc. South Korea is depicted as extremely modernized, developed. It's become one of the wealthiest countries in the world. We see this in various dramas that have been exported to different countries, and as you know, dramas are extremely popular around the world, especially in different parts of Asia, but also in Western countries. And we see also K-pop, where groups like BTS and Blackpink are wildly popular and becoming even more popular in places like the United States and in Europe. And when we look at all of these images and what is being produced, there's definitely this image of perfection, right? And so every individual that you see is young and thin and beautiful, and we see how this also has fed into the Korean cosmetics industry, which is applicable to both women and men. The cosmetics industry for men has really just taken off here in Korea, and again, they are exporting these to different parts of the world. But these are huge industries for the Korean economy, and this pursuit of perfection, which we will discuss in other lectures, especially when we talk about K-pop and Korean film and dramas and music and whatnot. This perfect image is really important and essential in spreading across and in gaining popularity in different parts of the world. And if we look at the origins of this, where we have this really dramatic modernization of Korea, South Korea, and Korea is depicted as this ultra modern, high-tech, and in some ways really, really great place to live. This has also been fueled by the economic development in Korea. So very recognizable international conglomerates such as Samsung or Hyundai or LG. These are brands that now receive international recognition and respect and are very popular in many different parts of the world. And these companies are supporting and fueling the Korean economy in many ways. And so when we see this, and when we examine the historical origins of where this comes from, we really need to take a look at how this happened, because what we see today is really just a recent phenomenon. But if we go back to post-liberation, the 1950s, particularly after the Korean War, it was a very, very different scenario and very different situation. So So this graph here just shows, you can see visually the takeoff of the South Korean economy. And this one is mapping gross national income per capita. We see that at this point early on in the 1950s, LG Electronics was established, and then in the 60s, the Hyundai Motor Company was established. This is going to be important when we look at the history of economic development, and particularly when we look at President Park Chung-hee, former President Park Chung-hee, and there's been this steady rise and a couple blips because of the Asian financial crisis and the global financial crisis, but otherwise there's a very sharp and steady rise. This one is a chart of the Korean economy and GDP growth, which averaged about 9 to 10% a year. So starting in 1961, we have a GDP about $2.4 billion, and in 1979, this skyrocketing to $65.5 billion. And a lot of this is due to the manufacturing sector, the real push for heavy industrialization. So as Mark Clifford said, boys who grew up working in rice paddies found themselves building oil tankers and designing semiconductor chips. And this really is indicative of the South Korean development. So if we look at post-war Korea, so in the north, actually North Korea fared extremely well. They received generous economic and technical assistance from other socialist countries such as the Soviet Union and from China. They had more pre-war industrial infrastructure than in South Korea. So if you remember from our lecture on colonial modernity and modernization, Japan had developed that northeastern region for industry, and economic growth rates in the north far surpassed that of South Korea well into the 1970s. In the late 1950s, the total industrial output was probably the highest in the world in North Korea. They were putting together these 5-year plans and often not only meeting but exceeding these plans. So post-war North Korea was doing quite well for itself. In contrast, post-war South Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world. In 1960, its gross domestic product per capita was only $79. So this was an issue not only economically, but also politically, because this is in the midst or at the height of the Cold War. And so this becomes an issue of communism versus capitalism, which system is better, which system is superior. And South Korea, representing capitalist countries, had to really sort of prove that they could at least keep up with North Korea. So what we see happening is when Park Chung-hee becomes president, there is this real push to develop the economy. So his idea was an idea of top-down industrialization and a guided economy. So this is what is described as the miracle on the Han. And this model was actually admired by Deng Xiaoping of China, by Mahathir of Malaysia, and both adopted this model for the development of their own countries because they felt that this was extremely effective. So let's take a look at Park Chung-hee. Park Chung-hee was in power in South Korea between 1961 to 1979. This is a long time. And we can characterize his his rule as very authoritarian. He believed in stateism, so a very, very strong state. He believed in growth firstism, which is the idea that regardless of what the costs are, the economy must grow. And that's the first priority. And he also emphasized national security. So because of the high tensions between the North and the South, he felt that South Korea had to be able to defend itself. And so there's this idea of national security, protecting South Korea, and anti-communist campaigns, because the communists were perceived or depicted as such a threat to the South that another attack from the North was imminent, and that South Korea had to be prepared at any time to be able to ward off North Korean attack. So in 1961, Park Chung-hee comes to power through a coup d'etat, and his rule was really a military dictatorship, and his vision was of wealth and power through economic development. In 1961, as you may recall, this is shortly after Syngman Rhee had resigned, and between the periods of the Korean War, the end of the Korean War in 1961, there really was very little change in the South Korean economy. So, frustrated and impatient with this, Park Chung-hee decided to stage a coup d'etat and take over, and to really push economic development. And part of what we see then is that, you know, if we look at when Park Chung-hee took over political power, for those of you who have been to the Han River, this is actually on the left here. This is what parts of the Han River used to look like. It looks very different now, obviously, but this is what parts of the Han River used to look like. This is an area, a suburb of Seoul, just outside of Seoul. We can see here that in both cases, these are very dilapidated, and there's no modern infrastructure. There's just this dirt road, and it looks unsanitary and haphazard. And so this was the scene in the early 1960s, and this was what Park Chung-hee wanted to just completely overhaul and change. So between 1961 to 63, for the first 2 years of Park Chung-hee's rule, he ruled through the Supreme Council for National Reconstruction. And you know, this was essentially a military dictatorship. So he declared martial law. There were widespread arrests to anybody who opposed him. There was widespread censorship of the press, so we have no freedom of speech. There was absolutely no political activity whatsoever. I don't know if you can even imagine, but no political activity. And this was also when he established the Korean Central Intelligence Agency. And this agency was like a watchdog that kept an eye out for anybody who was opposed to Park Chung-hee, or who posed any kind of political opposition to him. And if they were discovered, then they were arrested, thrown into jail. So this was a dictatorship. Between 1963 and 1972, we do see a bit of an easing in his rule. In 1962, martial law was lifted, and this is when Park Chung-hee starts to push for export-led industrial growth. But at the same time, there is widespread control over any kind of dissent. So this continues on for about 10 years. And then he suspends the Constitution in 1972 and declares a new constitution. And this is the Yushin Constitution, which essentially transformed the presidency into a legal dictatorship. So he's tightening his control over the country, and partially this is because he wants to push for export-led industrial policy. This is when we see a shift in a focus of manufacturing from import substitution to exports. At the beginning, Park Chung-hee's economy focused on light industrial products such as textiles, clothing, footwear, human hair wigs. But to really expand and develop this, he set the goal of exports increasing from $100 million to $1 billion in 6 years. Part of this was also fueled by the increasing tensions with North Korea, especially in 1968. So in this year, North Korea attempted to assassinate Park Chung-hee at the Blue House. So this meant that North Korean assassins had successfully crossed over the DMZ into South Korea and even approached the Blue House where the president lived. So this was a cause for great concern for Park Chung-hee, obviously. And then in the same year, there was also the capture of the USS Pueblo, which was a United States and American military spy ship. And instead of negotiating through South Korea, the Americans negotiated directly with the North Koreans and for the release of the ship and its crew. And this again caused a lot of concern for Park Chung-hee because he felt that if the United States was going to soften its stance against North Korea, then this could possibly encourage North Korea to attack South Korea, that the United States might not get involved. And so he used this as his reasoning to beef up military defense. And so in order to do this, we need to start producing things that we can use to defend ourselves, like weapons. So what this led to then was the development of the 4 great core factories. These were cast iron, steel, heavy machinery, and shipbuilding plants. And you need all of these things. These are the core ingredients to manufacturing weapons. And so the goal was to be able to build the basic materials necessary for producing weapons, and they were going to develop factories that could then manufacture these basic materials. But the problem was, how do we finance this? Because the government had very little money. There was a lack of funding. And the United States wasn't willing to fund this project. The United States felt that giving funds to a military dictator to build weapons would naturally lead to another civil war with the South attacking the North, or vice versa, and that the United States would again have to get involved, and so many thousands of American soldiers would be killed again. And so this wasn't something that the United States was willing to do. So what are Park Chung-hee's options? Well, he decides to mobilize existing resources and technological capability that were available among the big businesses, especially the chaebol, or the big conglomerates. So it's at this point that we begin to see this marriage between the state, the government, and the chaebol, these conglomerates. And for them, this very close cooperation, working together. And this is really what begins the expansion and the accumulation of terrific wealth of the Korean conglomerates. So, you know, these are all companies that are, again, readily recognizable to you: Samsung, LG, Hyundai, SK, GS, Lotte, Hyundai, Hyundai Heavy Industries, Hana. You know of all of these, and these conglomerates became the giants that they are today because of their close cooperation with the state. Now, again, if we look at the historical context in which all of this is happening, this kind of push and the need for the government to ally themselves with private companies, it becomes urgent during the 1970s because of partially the Vietnam War. So the United States in 1971 decided to withdraw 1/3 of its troops stationed in South Korea and send them to Vietnam instead. And this lack of American support, along with US negotiations with North Korea, as just previously mentioned, this only stirs up more anxiety and more of a need on Park Chung-hee's side for national security, defense, and to produce weapons and other military objects that the South Koreans need in order to protect themselves. So it's a combination of North Korean, South Korean relations and the tension, plus US North Korean negotiations, plus what was going on with the Vietnam War and the effects that this had for South Korea. So in 1971, Park declares a state of emergency in December, and then he declares martial law, declaring the Yushin Restoration in 1972. Again, this transformed the presidency into a virtual dictatorship where the president could himself appoint 1/3 of the National Assembly, and he had control of the military. But in terms of economic development, in January of 1973, Park declares the heavy and chemical industrialization policy as the top priority of Yushin reforms. So what this means is that the focus is on heavy and chemical industrialization in order to build up the defense industry in South Korea. By late 1879, there are 84 manufacturers in the construction of 6 industrial complexes, each focused on a target industry. So, for example, heavy machinery industrial complex was built at Changwon. Steel was built at Pohang. Shipbuilding at Okpo, electronics at Gumi, petrochemicals at Yeocheon, and non-ferrous metals at Onsan. So these were the 6 industrial complexes that were built up. And this is all to create a defense industry in South Korea. So first the focus was on light weapons, and South Korea purchased advanced technology and military hardware from France and the United States, mostly. They also wanted to purchase nuclear technology, and they had a deal with the French for this, but the US just squashed that and said, the last thing we need is for Park Chung-hee to have nuclear technology and power. But this is how they started developing the defense industry in South Korea. This is in combination with Park's New Village movement, the 새마을운동. And this was an attempt to revitalize the countryside. So there was this very unbalanced and lopsided development in South Korea, where we see certain cities, but mainly Seoul, that was being developed and modernized. But out in the countryside, it was still as if it was the 1950s. So he pushes this movement in order to build infrastructure, to modernize the countryside, and this included mass mobilization of the population in order to get them organized and to help and to organize these projects in the different villages. It also included a very broad educational program. So there was a whole ideology connected to the 새마을 movement or the New Village movement, where certain principles needed to be instilled and then applied if this was going to be accomplished. So, here in this picture we see education, and in these other pictures we see various community projects where the local people are being mobilized in order to modernize the villages. So if we look at the New Village movement and its goals and principles, it becomes clear as to what Park Chung-hee had in mind. So we can see that each village was to be organized into different groups. So there are leaders, there are working groups, there are a necessity to apply principles to existing organizations and to raise money for these cooperative works. And after that step is completed, the next step is to select projects and to plan these projects by recruiting villagers. This meant having to educate them and to instill in them a you-can-do-it spirit here. And a part of doing this is by holding group meetings where everybody is told that they need to play their part. And this is all for a public project or public property, and so everybody should be involved because we are one, and it's about coordinating everybody in the community and making sure that the community is in collaboration with the government. And then we have the main stage of the project where we have various goals to improve and modernize the village, and we have things like removing obstacles and modifying a distribution system, enhancing morals and communalism, providing a cultural center. So we see that we have these cooperative projects that are working with instilling education and the ideological values of the New Village movement. And in the final stage, we see that once these projects are successfully completed, then we can celebrate them, and there are various things that need to be established in order to ensure that this kind of community cooperation and efforts continue on. We can talk about in our discussion class about similarities and differences with, or how these ideas and the New Village movement, how they are related to our discussions and treatment of South Korean democracy and North Korean communism. All right, but these projects and these efforts were extremely successful for Park Chung-hee. So if we look at the annual GDP growth rates, we see that, you know, especially during this time here, that we see tremendous growth occurring for South Korea. And so it worked, you know, it was effective and it worked. But it did come at great humanitarian cost, because this dramatic development within a very short period of time could only occur with the massive mobilization of the working people, and also the consent of the population. So when you have factory workers who are working extremely long hours without compensation, working in hazardous conditions, in factories there were quotas for output, daily quotas that the factories had to meet. And it didn't matter if it took you 6 hours to meet the quota, or 10 hours, or 15 hours, or 18 hours. You worked until that quota was met. And if you worked in an 15-hour day, you weren't getting overtime. That was just too bad. You were too slow or something. And so in order to meet these quotas and to increase output, we see that shortcuts were taken for safety standards, and there were a lot of accidents that occurred or deaths, and it was, you know, unfair labor practices were widespread at this time, but it was for the maximization of profits through the exploitation of labor. And so what we see happening then as time goes by is a lot of these workers and farmers are dissatisfied and discontent with these conditions, because they're working themselves to the bone. Some of them are being injured, often permanently, and without any kind of compensation or care from the state. And so this causes a lot of contention. The next few pictures are pictures from an old coal mine in Gangwon province that was active during the Park Chung-hee era. This is the shower facility for the coal miners, but this was not put in until much later. So I think it was like the late 70s that this was put in. So if you can imagine being a coal miner and not having a shower facility, these are terrible conditions. We have some safety gear here. This is an old cargo train that would transport the coal. You know, let's say that you're a factory, you're a coal miner, and as we know, there are many fatal accidents that occur in coal mines. Let's say that you lose your arm gets cut off. You're not getting workers' comp, you're not getting disability. It's just goodbye, thank you for your service, and the next worker comes in and takes your place. And so this becomes a real problem. And students also who are opposed to the fact that Park Chung-hee is in power for so long and is basically a military dictator, we see a lot of demonstrations and a lot of social discontent. There are many strikes, which are exacerbated by the oil shocks of the 1970s. And Park Chung-hee keeps suppressing these demonstrations by force and through violence. And so At one point, it comes to a head between Park Chung-hee and the head of his CIA, Kim Jae-gyu, and it culminates in Kim Jae-gyu assassinating Park Chung-hee on October 26, 1979. And so this brings the era to a close, but development continues. Economic development continues through the 80s. This is an image from the 80s. And we see the protection of the domestic economy, largely to protect the conglomerates, the large conglomerates. And so we see mostly Korean cars that are being produced and consumed in the country. This is a street from the 1980s, 1987 to be exact. This is Namdaemun in the 1980s. And then we see further development. This is Itaewon. And we see further development into the 1990s, and where we see, more foreign exports coming in and more disposable income for South Koreans. So we see things like, I remember Bennigan's from the 1990s and the Hard Rock Cafe in Itaewon. And then we get to the current period where we have, in many cases in South Korea, just really spectacular wealth amongst the upper class. This is a picture of a Rolls-Royce Phantom, which is one of the most expensive cars produced. It's the starting cost. It starts at about $500,000, and it's not uncommon to see these kinds of luxury cars in South Korea as you're driving around today. But the dark side of all of this and this economic development is that because of this very, very close cooperation and the marriage of the state with these corporations, the conglomerates, is that this has led to a culture of corruption. And it's at first, in the beginning, was difficult to distinguish between what is corruption and what is just the government and corporations collaborating with each other. But over time, from the 1960s and 1970s, there has been increasing and just outright corruption, where the heads of many of these conglomerates, they receive hundreds of millions of dollars in bribes from businesses, or they pay off politicians in order to get certain deals that they want to push through. And so as a result of this, we have a series of, every South Korean president since Park Chung-hee who has been accused of corruption and for taking in millions and millions of dollars of bribes. And in the case of Roh Tae-woo and Chun Doo-hwan, they were both arrested and served prison sentences, but they only served for about 2 years. And then we see, continuing probes into this. And most recently, this has become it has come to light to be a widespread and even more serious problem than we've understood it to be. This is an effigy of Park Geun-hye, and we can see the logos of major conglomerates that are in her pocket and tied to her. And this corruption was eventually what led to her downfall and her impeachment. But we also see that this is an enduring problem. We have the heads of these various conglomerates who are testifying and being investigated for possible corruption. And Lee Jae-young, the heir to Samsung, is still trying to dodge these allegations and This is a real problem in a part of your readings, and so there are two sides, to this economic development. Is yes, we have, as we saw at the beginning of the lecture, this very glitzy, glossy, glamorous aspect to South Korea, but on the other hand, we also have the humanitarian cost and the corruption and the disparity between the haves and the have-nots. And so these are all issues that we can discuss in our discussion. All right, so thank you for your attention, and I'll see you at discussion.